All right, so 4 kids stabbed, November 2022. Moscow, Idaho. I mean, it's the kind of thing that just sticks with you, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I
Mhm.
think it's that small town setting, a college town where you just wouldn't expect something that brutal to happen. It just really gets under your skin.
Like, think about it. You got Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, all young, all just living their lives. And then,
And then you have Bryan Kohberger.
yeah, the PhD student studying criminology. I mean, talk about irony, right?
Yeah, I mean, it really makes you think, like, was he, I don't know, fascinated by crime? Did they lead him down this path?
We may never know the answer to that. But let's back up a bit, paint a picture for our listeners. So, Moscow, Idaho. This is classic college town USA, right?
Absolutely. A close-knit community, that kind of idyllic, safe feeling you get in those places, is what makes this whole thing even more shocking.
And the house on King Road. 6 bedrooms, 5 roommates, plus Ethan visiting Xana, his girlfriend.
It was just a normal Saturday night. Kaylee and Maddie were at a bar. Xana and Ethan were at a party. Just typical college stuff.
They all got back to the house around 1:45 a.m. 2 other roommates, Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk, were downstairs. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary.
Right. And then things get really murky. Around 4 a.m., Xana was on TikTok, maybe waiting on a DoorDash order. Kaylee's dog was active upstairs. Just normal house sounds.
But sometime between 4 and 4:25 a.m., everything changed. Someone entered the house and committed these horrible murders.
It's just a chilling thought.
Yeah.
And the fact that there was no forced entry, that really raises questions.
Yeah, that sliding glass door was a big focus early on. Was it open? Did the killer know the layout of the house? We still don't have all the answers.
And then there's Dylan Mortensen's account. She woke up around 4 a.m., heard what she thought was Kaylee playing with her dog.
That initial sense of normalcy makes it even creepier, you know?
Oh, for sure. But then she hears crying from Xana's room. And then a male voice saying, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." I mean, chills, right?
Absolutely chilling. It makes you wonder, was he trying to, like, comfort the victims? Or was it a way to control the situation, to keep them quiet?
It's such a disturbing detail. And then Dylan opens her door 3 times. The third time, she sees him. A man in dark clothing, a mask, but she notices his bushy eyebrows.
He walks right past her towards that sliding glass door. I mean, can you imagine the terror?
It's almost like he was just a ghost.
Yeah.
And then silence. But here's the thing. The 911 call didn't come until almost noon. That's hours later.
It's hard to wrap your head around that. I mean, friends came over, saw Xana, thought she had just passed out. It's just,
Unimaginable.
yeah, I think it speaks to the shock, the trauma of it all. It can be paralyzing. You don't always process things rationally in those moments.
Right. And it wasn't until later that the full extent of the horror was discovered. The investigation really ramped up from there, ultimately leading to Bryan Kohberger's arrest in Pennsylvania on December 30th, 2022.
Pennsylvania, that's a long way from Idaho. Makes you wonder, was he trying to run? Did he think he could get away with it? So let's dive into the evidence. First, that knife sheath found on Maddie's bed. No victim DNA on it, which is interesting.
Right. Could mean he wore gloves, or maybe the sheath was dropped after the attack. It's a detail investigators would have really scrutinized.
But here's the big one. DNA on the snap of that sheath. They used investigative genetic genealogy and traced it back to Kohberger.
Yeah, that's some pretty cutting-edge stuff. They basically take DNA from the crime scene, compare it to public databases like ancestry websites.
So they don't find an exact match, but they find relatives, right? And then they build a family tree and narrow it down.
Exactly. It led them right to Kohberger. And then they matched it to his father's DNA from trash. I mean, that's pretty damning.
Then you got the white Hyundai Elantra. Cameras caught a car like that circling the King Road house multiple times that night.
Not just once, like you said, but 4 times.
Yeah.
It's like he was casing the place, figuring out his moves.
That last pass was around 4:04 a.m., and it was seen leaving the area at 4:20 a.m., right in that critical window.
And then there's his phone activity. It pings in Pullman at 2:47 a.m. where he lived. Then it goes dark for 2 hours.
2 hours.
Yeah.
Right during the murder.
It reappeared south of Moscow later. I mean, you can turn your phone off, but the timing is pretty suspicious.
And then there are those Amazon purchases. 8 months before the murders, Kohberger bought a Kalbar knife, a sheath, and a sharpener online.
And guess what? The sheath found at the scene. Same brand.
Talk about a direct link.
It's definitely something the prosecution will use to argue premeditation. But of course, the defense will say lots of people own knives. It's circumstantial.
Right. But then there's his arrest. Reports say he was wearing gloves, being super careful with trash, like those habits from the crime scene stuck with him.
It's an interesting observation. At his arraignment, he didn't enter a plea, so the judge entered not guilty for him. Pretty standard procedure, though.
So that's the prosecution side. But the defense has been busy too. They're challenging a lot of this, starting with that DNA evidence from the genetic genealogy.
Yeah, they're questioning how reliable it is, if it's even legal. They say people who put their DNA on those ancestry sites never consented to it being used for criminal investigations. It's a privacy issue.
They've also downplayed those Amazon purchases. They say, hey, anyone can buy a knife online. It doesn't prove he did it.
Which, to be fair, is true. They'll probably try to poke holes in the connection between that specific knife and the murders.
And then there's that 12 hours of surveillance footage of a white Elantra. The defense says it's too vague, too much data, doesn't definitively prove it was Kohberger's car at the exact times.
I mean, that's a common defense tactic. They'll try to overwhelm the prosecution with information, make them question their own evidence.
There's also this weird thing about a selfie Kohberger took on the day of the murders. The prosecution says his bushy eyebrows match Dylan Mortenson's description. The defense says that's subjective.
And they're right, to an extent. Eyewitness testimony can be unreliable, especially when it's based on one detail like eyebrows.
And then there's the autism spectrum disorder angle. The defense brought in a neuropsychologist who said Kohberger might have ASD and that his intense gaze and rigid thinking could bias a jury.
They even asked for the death penalty to be taken off the table, which the judge denied. It's probably because there's not enough legal precedent to support dropping the death penalty based on ASD alone.
Then in February of this year, 2025, some court documents were unsealed. It came out that the lead detective had actually identified Kohberger as a suspect back in December 2022, all thanks to that FBI genetic genealogy work.
But those documents also mention something interesting: unknown male B. Apparently, there was DNA evidence that wasn't from Kohberger or the victims, and the police didn't really investigate it further.
The defense is all over that, of course.
Yeah, they're going to say it points to someone else being involved, that the investigation was rushed and focused on Kohberger prematurely.
So as things stand now, the prosecution's case is built on that car, the phone data, the DNA on the sheath, and Dylan Mortenson's testimony. It's a lot of circumstantial evidence.
It is. But the prosecution will argue that all those pieces, taken together, paint a clear picture of guilt. The defense, on the other hand, will try to dismantle each piece, offer alternative explanations.
And the trial date?
Set for August 11th, 2025. But it's been moved from Moscow to Boise. Probably because of all the media attention, the small-town dynamics. It'd be hard to find an impartial jury in Moscow.
Makes sense. Jury selection is supposed to start July 30th and could take 3 months. That's a long time.
Yeah, it shows you how complex this case is, how much scrutiny every juror will be under. Both sides want to make sure they get it right.
And we're still seeing new filings. The prosecution wants to use those Amazon purchases and that selfie to show Kohberger's intent. The defense wants to suppress evidence from the warrants on his phone, car, and apartment. It's a constant back and forth.
Typical legal maneuvering. The defense is trying to limit the evidence against their client, while the prosecution is trying to present the strongest case possible.
And they still haven't decided if that genetic genealogy evidence is even admissible.
That's a huge question mark. If it's allowed, it's a major win for the prosecution. If not, it could weaken their case significantly.
And then there are the surviving roommates. Dylan and Bethany are expected to testify. I can't imagine how difficult that must be.
Their testimony will be crucial, especially Dylan's. She's the one who saw Kohberger. But the defense will likely question her memory, her ability to accurately recall details under such extreme stress.
Public reaction has been intense, especially from Kaylee's family. They've been very vocal about wanting justice, and understandably so.
Absolutely. They've lost a daughter, a sister. The legal process can feel painfully slow when you're the one waiting for answers.
The defense has hinted at a possible alibi. They say Kohberger was driving around stargazing that night, but the prosecution doesn't seem to be buying it.
It does seem a bit far-fetched. Stargazing is pretty vague. They'd need some solid evidence to back that up.
So we've covered a lot, but there are still so many unknowns. Like, what was the motive? Why would Kohberger do this? Was it random? A targeted attack? Did he know the victims?
The motive is a big question mark, and Kohberger's background in criminology just adds another layer to it.
It's unsettling. And then there's that unknown male B DNA. Could there be another person involved?
It's definitely something the defense will keep pushing. They'll try to create reasonable doubt, suggest that the police didn't fully investigate all possibilities.
And that 8-hour delay in calling 911, I think that's something a lot of people are still stuck on.
Trauma can explain some of it, but we still don't know exactly what happened in those hours leading up to the call. It's a gap in the timeline that the defense might try to exploit.
And remember, they demolished the King Road house back in December 2023. Could that have impacted the case? Could there have been evidence lost?
It's possible. The prosecution likely documented everything thoroughly, but the defense might argue that they lost the opportunity to examine the crime scene firsthand.
And even though the judge didn't drop the death penalty based on the ASD suggestion, could that still play a role in the trial?
It might. The defense could use it to explain some of Kohberger's behavior, but they'd have to be careful not to alienate the jury.
And finally, those sealed court documents. Hundreds of pages we haven't seen. What's in them? Could they change everything we think we know?
It's hard to say. Sealed documents usually contain sensitive information that could jeopardize the case if it's made public.
Oh.
But it's certainly possible that there are bombshells in there.
So, as we wrap up, it's clear this case is far from over. A lot hinges on that trial date, August 11th, 2025.
Right. And remember, jury selection starts July 30th. That's going to be a long process. Finding an impartial jury in a case this high profile, it's not easy.
This is a story about justice, about finding answers for the victims and their families. Will Bryan Kohberger be found guilty? Will we finally understand what happened that night?
It's a case that really makes you think about the limits of our legal system, about how we piece together truth from fragments of evidence, and how sometimes, even with all the technology and investigation, some questions might just remain unanswered.
It's a lot to process. Thanks for helping us break it down. This has been The Deep Dive. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives like this, and let us know what you think. Is Kohberger guilty, or is this a case of a man being framed? We want to hear from you.
We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a case that's captivating the nation. Until then, stay curious.
And stay safe.